Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and this is episode 106. Today we're discussing the author Idwal Jones, one of my favorite wine writers, and one of the more unique ones that California has produced. He isn't really a wine writer. His only wine-related books are one nonfiction-ish book and one novel on wine, but they're both best in class. He also wrote many other books on a wide variety of subjects. His novel, The Vineyard, is remarkable for how much it puts you into the setting of a Napa Valley winery pre-Prohibition, while Vines in the Sun takes you through a tour of early California winemaking, making stops up and down the state. Both were written in the mid-1900s and still read vividly today. The books can be a little tough to find, but there are links in the show notes to purchase both titles. A reminder that I have a Patreon at patreon.com/IndieWinePodcast. The link is in the show notes also. If you're enjoying the podcast, any amount to help me keep telling wine stories ad-free is super appreciated. It's all run independently and meant to be available for everyone. Telling a friend or sharing on social media or leaving a review are great ways to help out too. Okay, here we go. And still the vine her ancient ruby yields. Idwal Jones was born in 1888 or 1890. An equal number of reputable sources say each date. At either rate, the family moved from North Wales to Pennsylvania in 1902 at the urging of his geologist father. The slate quarries he would work in there were reaching their peak production just as the family moved. The young Idwal would be homeschooled due to some childhood health issues, and his father had become inspector of the mines in New York, causing the family to move there where Jones would study mechanical engineering. At various times in his young life, he'd work in the slate quarries, as a mechanician, in factories, and as a prospector and rancher in California. His first newspaper jobs were as a reviewer, part-time for the San Francisco Chronicle starting in 1915, and then full-time as a drama critic for the SF Daily News. He would eventually take on more responsibility at other stops, writing features for the Examiner and traveling Central America and Europe as a foreign correspondent, living for a time in both Paris and Rome before returning to the United States and New York. His first book, The Splendid Shilling, was published in 1926 with the California Gold Rush as its setting. It was followed by the 1936 book, China Boy and Other Stories, and 5 years after by The Black Bayou. The Vineyard, which we'll get to in a minute, was the next year. Others would include Vermilion about a mercury mine, High Bonnet about the world of French chefs, and Arc of Empire about the Montgomery block of San Francisco. We discussed that building in the California Wine Association episodes, especially episode 4, the Calamity Edition. It was one of the few buildings undamaged by the 1906 earthquake and stood where the Transamerica Pyramid does today. Most of his books would be translated to Welsh even years after their publication. Jones' interests were varied. Aside from the wine and vineyards of California, each book seemed to draw from his personal experience. Maybe it was a character based in part on his life or things he had seen in his travels. He kind of wore his influences on his sleeve more than most in that way. He was a fan of food and gastronomy, at least since his time in Paris and Rome. MFK Fisher would be a regular pen pal of his. And of course, early California played a part in many of his works. Vines in the Sun is perhaps the best wine book available for picking up and reading whatever page you happen to land on. It'll be a good one. Of all the wine books I own, it's one of only 3 that I have multiple copies of. Jones takes you on tours of pre-Prohibition California wineries, both well-known and forgotten to time. Cresta Blanca, Krug, Fountain Grove, To Kalon, and Almaden appear alongside Pedrusky, A.R. Morrow, and Bialetti. The book was written in 1949, over 75 years ago, but it reads much more current. It's more like a cross between the popular travel logs of the mid to late 1800s and maybe Anthony Bourdain or Hunter S. Thompson. It owes more than a little to Wines and Vines of California also. Jones establishes himself pretty early on as an unreliable narrator, Some details are too good to be true or too specific to be known. The base is correct on many, but the embellishment can vary from light to heavy. Never let the truth get in the way of a good story. Some details appear in the book that are well known, and others that are heard nowhere else. According to wine historian William Heinz, Jones would burn his research documents when he finished with a book. This obviously makes it tough to confirm any of his research findings. The sentences fly by, though, and it's easy to visualize it all. And the characters jump off the page. The book hits most of the winemaking regions of California, at least those that were around at the time. Napa, Sonoma, Livermore, El Dorado, Paso Robles, San Gabriel. I'm going to read a couple little excerpts on the Jacob Schramm part. Schramm's old vineyard is far up on a wooded slope below the village of Calistoga with its plumed geysers. This seems not grape country at all, but tree-clad and shaggy foothill country, utterly beyond taming. Beyond is Mount St. Helena, even wilder where Napa Valley ends. The Russians came here first, and Princess Helena de Gagarin, niece of the Tsar and wife of the Governor-General of Siberia and the Russian colonies in the Pacific, climbed to the top and christened it in honor of her patron saint. This indefatigable princess, bred to the saddle, was on her way to Fort Ross, where an outpost was held before the teeth of first the Spanish, then the Mexican authorities. The road, shaded with flowering buckeye, is unmarked as it leaves the highway, and the pilgrim must be a stout-hearted motorist if he does not retreat in dismay from the ever-growing roughness of it. Seldom is it visited now, this place, but for long it was the most famous in this end of the Napa region. Yet down this road only 40 years ago, its cheery proprietor, ruddy and white-bearded like Father Christmas, used to careen in his tally-ho at fearsome speed. Struggle up another 1,000 feet and you find Schramm's house still there. There's no description of it as clear as Stevenson's. I'm going to skip the part from Stevenson's Silverado Squatters, but it's a good read also, of course. The time of Stevenson's sojourn was 1880. He was spending his honeymoon in a cabin at the derelict mine of Silverado on a shoulder of Mount St. Helena a few miles away. Schramm was even then spoken of as the Nestor of the valley. That title must have fallen to him through the prestige of his hawk rather than for seniority. Near Calistoga was the ranch of the illustrious Mr. Krug, the real Nestor of the Vignerons. And on the further side of St. Helena was Judge J.H. McCord, a 49er of majestic beard who expounded the law as justice of the peace and tended his 100 acres of vines, most of them on the flat, where the burgher of prodigal yield grew an Alsatian wine, not quite ordinary when the summer was cool. They were excellent men, but for my part I'm glad Max knew Jacob Schramm, who after the Civil War drove out here by wagon from San Francisco, a 12-hour journey, and with knapsack climbed over these slopes and found the bonanza that was to be his vineyard. Some instinct led him to ignore the flat and explore the upper reaches through the woods that were almost impenetrable. I think he followed the bed of a rivulet that expires in summer, but in spring rushes in lively fashion and fills the gully with gusts of sound. It is virgin country still in some tracts, and Stevenson must have looked about him with an observant eye. For what he saw and what the pilgrim may yet see, he described in his Spanish tale, Olalla. No one in the region had broken ground higher than Schramm, who made a clearing among oaks and between two ravines set out his plants, in stony earth, unpromising to anyone but a native of the shale-littered Rheingau. Those firstlings, the black malvacees, he later must have regrafted to what is called the Napa Golden Chasselas, as the Palomino is called here. It makes a harsh table wine, but is admirable in some regions for sherry. The foothill growers went in hopefully for Palomino. It leafs and sets fruit early, and deer, lean after the winter's fast, leaped over the fences to gorge upon it. Bear cubs, a lesser plague, squeezed in, and Schramm had to whack and thump them out of the lot with his gun stock. That pseudo-golden chasselas has little perfume when grown at this altitude, and that notable bouquet which Stevenson praised must have come from a blending with the Muscat Hamburg, and Schramm doubtless got cuttings of it from Dressel's Rhine farm on the heights above Sonoma. More trees fell to his axe. At night, he plied his German chemistry books. Room was made for more plants. While these grew, his China boys cut long chambers into the hillside where Schrammsberger of various hues was aged in vats that rose to the vaulted roof. They built a solid New England house. Prosperity came upon our backwoodsmen with a rush. Medals were earned by Schramberger at the county fairs. 2 of its varieties were unmatched for their serious, their ascetic quality. The Bohemian Club and the leading merchants were grateful for what parcels of it the farm could spare. One must be glad Stevenson wrote his impressions of this Napa immortal. Other worthies were in the neighborhood, and it is quite probable he saw or met them all. Every few days, Stevenson visited drowsy St. Helena, where he dawdled at the office of the Star Weekly. And there's a photograph of him in a bowler hat, camped on the doorstep, smoking and taking in what stir there was in the village. That's just a short section of the Jacob Schramm chapter. Jones' thoughts kind of wander and weave, and it's a great read. I'm going to skip down a little bit in this Napa Valley chapter until he gets to Childs and Yount. Mount Diamond, Schramm's place was called on the old maps, and that name is returning. High up on the ridge are ledges of rock that glitter in the sunlight, though some are in the shade of oaks. In the days of the Mexican governors, this was a rendezvous for men of the long rifle who lived about the valley, and they met here to hunt and camp for the night. They were backwoodsmen of an age, and in their adventurous youth had beaten trails through the Indian nations to the Sierra. The strangest of this group was John B. Childs, an ex-trapper, a lean 7-foot Kentuckian with frosty eye, mouth like a knife slash, and a rifle stock tucked under his arm. His homestead, reached through a gap in the hills, is still known as Childs Valley, which is mostly vineyards, and he planted the first. No more roam, Jack Chilley's the guide, nightmare of the Shoshones, and mighty tracker of the elk and grizzly. The vineyard took caring. He plowed, he harrowed and pruned, and on Sunday he trod to church. Colonel Childs, town councilor and vestryman, proper in tails and cravat. He was not the first nomad made sedentary by the vine. One of his books, a little manual of sound doctrine and sober practice, and his 2 rifles are still preserved. The colonel broke out at times to go bar hunting and wind up on Mount Diamond with another companion of his wild youth, the North Carolinian who owned Yountville, where the grape region of Napa begins. It is probable that George Yount rose higher than any frontiersman in this part of the state. He had come to Santa Barbara in 1831, and there was such a great report of him as Captain Buckskin that he was sent for by Captain Dana, the merchant and fur trader. He agreed to shoot sea otter, taking half the proceeds for himself and his Kanakas, Dana finding the boat and supplies. Adept at woodcraft, he often hunted deer with a knife, but otter had the sea to dive into. Yount was no mariner. The waves made unsteady both his aim and his stomach. The recoil of his gun sent him floundering. But he mastered his new trade and kept at it for 5 years until the sea otter vanished. One hears of him next calling at the Petaluma ranch of General Vallejo, who was then building his large adobe. Indians were already puddling clay for tiles. Yount, who had built a log house or 2, asked for work at carpentry. "You see, the casa is all adobe," said the general. "Very little wood, and we already have the doors." "Well, I can make you shingles. I will roof your house with shingles like in the Carolinas." "Shingles?" asked the general. "Those are what?" Yount split a redwood block and made a shingle with which the general and innovator weighed musingly. Nowhere in the Californias from the old Jesuit colonies up to this settlement, the most northerly of all, was their house roofed with shingles. He approved of their lightness and asked Yount to proceed. The roofing was done in 7 weeks, and in payment, Yount asked for a parcel of land in Napa Valley and the loan of a few cattle. We'll stop right there for now, just as Yountville is about to be founded. We discussed the founding some more in episode 33 and the life of George Yount. It was the first of the short story episodes. Through most of the book, the story stays pretty tight, but there is confusion. like in the telling of the story of Young Moon. He was the helper, blender, likely occasional winemaker and distiller of the Chauvet winery in Glen Ellen. He gets as much text as nearly anyone in the book, but under the wrong name. Jones calls the Chinese blender working for Chauvet Bo Sang Ki. Others remember a man named Quan Ki who ran the laundry in town. Children used to tease and annoy Quan Ki by running a rattle against his window of the laundry. It's likely that Jones got these names mixed up. Neither of these men, who were likely the same man, were Young Moon, of course. The great wine historian Charles Sullivan called Vines in the Sun, quote, an anecdotal history of wine in California and the leading personalities in the industry. It contains much useful and accurate information interspersed with myth and tall tales, unquote. Another wrote that it was, quote, suffused with the art of a literator, unquote. Either way, it's interspersed with the history of California and the figures that surround the wine growers. To that part, this podcast likely owes a debt. I think context is everything in history and nothing happens in a vacuum. The New York Times review said, quote, for the serious student of the future of American viticulture, there's the heartening thesis that more and more the little farmer, on whom distinction in wine depends, will label his own product, and if the larger vintner still handles it, he will do so without abolishing its individuality in his mass-producing vats, unquote. The simple illustrations in the book by Albert J. Camille round it out really well. At the top of each chapter, a line-drawn illustration brings to life the area you're about to hear about. There are a couple that accompany the Instagram post if you want to see them. Overall, it's a book you can read in your spare time or straight through, following the leisurely 1,000 miles that Jones traveled over 75 years ago. The Vineyard is probably the best novel based around wine. It's not just me who thinks so. Ruth Reichel and Robert Mondavi did also. He wrote the foreword for the re-released printing. I was a little slow to embrace the book. Historical fiction is not my usual idea of an interesting book to read. But as one writer said, Jones was perhaps the only one capable of writing this book and making it this good. Maynard Amoryne thought Jones was one of the few people who could write this book at all. Gertrude Atherton called it a masterpiece, even as she noted how hard he was to pin down as an author and belonged to no particular school of writing. Others, despite his Welsh birth, called him, quote, Californian through and through, unquote. Some ranked The Vineyard among the best books of fiction about California. The book focuses on the young Alda Pendle. At one point, her family's farm was among the best known in Napa, high up in the Mayacamas Mountains. Her father had perfected a hybrid grape. Hybrid in Napa, and it made the most renowned wines in the valley. But now her father and the ranch are gone. On a rainy night, she finds herself across the valley at the Villa Montino estate with her young son Cleve. The former proprietor of Montino and her father had been friends and then enemies. Montino, now run by the son Hector, has kept the ranch, but its legacy has faded. The characters of Montino really come to life, and their interactions with Horasty, Wetmore, Crabbe, Schramm, Bialetti, Hilgard, Krug, Hussman, Wente, members of the Novitiate and Edge Hill wineries do the story even more justice. Kanai Nagasawa appears as a man named Duke Liu. I'm unsure the reason Jones chose to rename Nagasawa, but it's definitely him. It feels like Schramm, who we just heard about, influenced the story in a large way also. There are clear similarities in the description of his estate and Montino. This is really a story of old California and old Napa. The region is changing from selling barrels to bottles. There are underground prize fights in the Carquinez Strait near Vallejo. And afterwards, they drink H.W. Crabbe's Rafosco wine. Vines are pruned, furloughs are dug, fields are grafted. Farmers battle against phylloxy. A wine goes mousy. They note that they should have added sulfur. And some Anaheim colonists come by to pick up work after their vineyards were decimated by Pierce's disease. Characters speak like old-time farmers. most of the ones I've known at least. Conversations wander and jump from topic to topic, and the real conversation doesn't start until it's over. But everything always comes back to the ranch and the fields. There's some Steinbeck in the words and characters. They feel honest, like you know them, even the minor ones. The Chinese and Mexican characters are alive and integral to the story, treated with respect in the world and on the page. Portions of the story take place at the Flores Tamale Parlor just down the hill from Montino. Wing, the main Chinese character in the story, works at Montino as a helper. He likely has nearly his entire life. He's part of the family, respected for advice, known to help the children, and everyone in town turns out for his kite flies. Montino is his as much as anyone else's. He's seen lots come and go from its vineyards. I'll read just the first few pages of the book. No spoilers here. The hooded cart rolled hub deep through muck and gravel, the ponies plunging ahead now with earnestness, as if they were suddenly aware that so weary a road must end with rest and a stable. It was pitchy dark. The drizzle had turned to a plumping rain. The girl flung sack on reins and resigned herself to the guidance of the animals, cunning in all the wagon tracks on this wooded slope of the Napa Valley. They were close now to the foot of St. John's Peak. In a jumble of gullies, cleared pockets, torrents, and stands of fir and madrone. Montino was at the end of this road. She had come close to it once when she was a child, and her father, with bundles of vine cuttings to sell, had taken her along for company. But that was long ago, on a midsummer day, and she remembered only the smells. The dust, the reek of tarweed, and whiffs of pomace from the wineries. And this was winter's end, the dank air pungent with odors of eucalyptus, sodden earth, and leaves. At the crossroads, the ponies took the left fork, the steep banks glistening in the rain, and the glow from the lantern hung on the shaft had streaks of black and white and a painted look. Soon the wagon wheels were crunching over lava. The girl listened curiously. Her father had never a fair word for the men that lived at Montino, but for the fields they tilled, his praise was unbounded. It's fine and honest earth, girl, full-handed to the grape and the trees that keep off wind and sunburn. Too good to be merely rich. There was never a regola that deserved that farm. The animals pulled up at a wooden barrier. The girl got out in southwester and high boots, held up the lantern and examined the gate. It was heavy and large, secured by a rusty chain, and above it was an arch upheld by two pillars of masonry lost under creepers. The legend on the signboard was hardly legible. Villa Montino, G. Regola, proprietor. The grandeur of the entrance impressed her. It was only the great wine estates in this part of California that had both a gate and a name. She tied the animals to a post, climbed with the lantern, and sat a moment on the top rail, looking into the darkness before her. "You wait here, old-timer," she said, speaking towards the cart. "I'm going in to inquire. Maybe they'll let us stay, maybe not. But it won't be the first time we've camped out." She whistled through her teeth, fastened the strap of her southwester, and jumped down. The gleam of her lantern had carried far, and as she trudged up the path under the dripping firs, a dog came charging at her. Eyes burning, he contested every foot of her progress, recoiling on his haunches at each throat-splitting outburst of frenzy. Being half mastiff and half coyote, he had both muscle and lungs. In one swoop, she caught his paw. Alda Pendle had the vine dresser's strength of grip, a well-gloved hand, and a way of her own with dogs. Caught in that paralyzing squeeze, the dog, unable to bark or snap, suffered the indignity of a rub and pulled ears. "Now will you be quiet, huh? You going to be good? You trot along now and show me the way." Another hard squeeze and the dog surrendered, faced about, and with sidelong glances walked before his conqueror through the trees to the villa. She could discern it as a blacker bulk in darkness, with a silhouette of peaked gables against the torn sky. Her father, who had visited the Villa Montino when it was new and had sold some of his best vines to the senator, told her that it had iron deer on the lawn and statues and palms in the hallway. The estate had begun to run down when she was a child, long after the senator had sold much of it and given the rest to his son. But it was still the Villa Montino, and the eminence of it bore upon her and weighed her spirits. The dog led her to the back. She could not see much in the lashing rain, only shadows, more trees, and a pump from which duckboards were laid to the rear porch. The dog crouched there, on the porch, fangs white in the gleam from the window, and grinned amiably. It was perhaps the only welcome she would get at Montino. The fatigue of a long day's journey in through the valley, for she had been looking for work at every farm this side of Rutherford, the steadiness of the downpour, and the gloom of the house had combined to oppress her. If Mr. Regola turned out to be unhospitable, she could hardly ask shelter of him, not even at the barn. It would mean sleeping at the gate, then going over the ridge in the morning into Sonoma County and its vineyards. That's the first 3 pages or so. It really is a great book to pick up. Either of these books would make a great addition to your bookshelf. Part of the fun is in the comparison, a truthful-ish story of California wine with a lot of embellishment, and a novel about California wine filled with some of the most truthful details you'll find. Jones would pass away at his home in Laguna Beach, California in November of 1965. No matter what they tell you, the prettiest wine is only to drink. Thanks for listening today. Hopefully I've enticed you enough to check out some of Jones' work. They're both books you can breeze through and super unique. Vines in the Sun in particular has both delighted and confounded generations of wine writers and historians. Again, there are links in the show notes of both books if you're interested. Please follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at Indie Wine Podcast. You can email Indie Wine Podcast or Instagram with comments, questions, or feedback. If you're enjoying the podcast, I'd love if you told a friend or wine lover about it and help spread the word. Rating, reviewing, or donating at patreon.com/IndieWinePodcast helps a lot too. It all goes to offsetting podcast expenses, keeps it ad-free, available for everyone, allows for more episodes, and helps support independent folks. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.